of bribery. And he describes bribery as an inducement improperly influencing the performance of a public function meant to be gratuitously exercised. Now, one of the reasons that I put that on the table is because in this discussion today, we have focused very, very heavily on public corruption. We focused very, very heavily on governments, on public servants, on politicians, on regulation. I want to locate the problem of corruption someplace else, and I'm going to try to give you some reasons. So I think this kind of definition, while very interesting, is also potentially misleading. And so in my work, I've created a more complex definition, which tries to provide, if you like, a more objective account of bribery, which I think is important. So my definition of bribery, I'm talking specifically here about bribery, is any attempt, whether successful or not, to persuade someone in a position of responsibility to make a decision or recommendation on grounds other than the intrinsic merits of the case at hand, with a view to the advantage or advancement of him or herself or another person or group to which he or she is linked through personal commitment, obligation, employment, or individual, professional, or group loyalty. Now, there are a number of virtues to this particular definition. For one thing, it doesn't mention public officials and acknowledges that bribery is a problem which can occur in a variety of different contexts. Indeed, my view is that bribery is driven by the private sector, not by the public sector, particularly under conditions of globalization. And the other element of this particular definition is that it gets away from the idea of personal enrichment and begins to acknowledge what is, in fact, I think, something of importance in understanding the phenomenon. That bribery is often engaged in by people who think they're doing the right thing. It's not just a matter of unjust or inappropriate personal enrichment based on a position where one can extract dollars, if you like, or find financial resources from a public system. It also occurs in situations where people are working, as they understand it, for the benefit of other people. I sometimes refer to altruistic bribery, and I think it's vastly more important. Watergate was an example, and a lot of what has gone on in the United States are examples of altruistic bribery, people who take risks in order to advance a cause which they think is extraordinarily important, and don't believe, because they're operating within a particular system of values, don't believe that what they're doing is unethical. That dimension of what they're doing simply disappears from the picture within which they're operating. Why is bribery a problem? Well, it's been mentioned. I'll just very briefly touch on a number of issues. We could talk about this for a long time, but it has to be thought through. Bribery undermines economic development. There's now, I think, the research has demonstrated very clearly that is in fact the case. It distorts public policy in sometimes very extreme ways. And I wish I had time to provide some examples, but in a sense, there have been examples all day long. It undermines democratic institutions. In fact, that's one of its purposes, is to render democratic institutions innocuous. And it corrodes the quality of public services. So it has distinct social implications and impacts. For corporations, and I think this is interesting, it's important to recognize that bribery doesn't just impact negatively social systems, it impacts corporations in negative ways. It can have a boomerang effect. That's to say, it can come back to hit the corporation itself, where people begin to use their skills against the corporation rather than for it. Can damage, can destroy personal and corporate reputations overnight. Arthur Anderson's a very good example of that particular phenomenon. And it generates serious risks of criminal charges, imprisonment, substantial fines. So it's a phenomenon that corporations can't afford to ignore. And from the point of view of the operation of the economic system, which is extremely important in this context, bribery undermines competition. So it's the enemy, if you like, of free market enterprise. It shifts focus from issues of quality. People are no longer concerned with the quality of the goods and services that are being received, or less concerned than they ought to be. And significantly, and I think the point's been made by other people, it disadvantages small and medium-sized businesses in the developing world, but also in countries like Canada, who may be competing for contracts in other parts of the world. So on a definition, I think in fact I must have missed that, the definition, but let me just define ethics, because we need a definition of ethics on the table as well. My definition of ethics is a concern for the well-being of oneself, of others, and of society as a whole. That's the definition that I work with in my work in the Schulich School of Business as a teacher and in other contexts as well. The interesting thing about that definition is that it recognizes that people have moral obligations to themselves. I think you can understand the context, whistleblowing context, much better if you understand that people are wrestling with moral values which have to do with their responsibilities as individuals to themselves and to others close to them, as well as their role responsibilities to the institutions for which they work. But ethics goes beyond concern with oneself to concern with others, and a concern for society as a whole. That's a definition that was actually put on the table by Albert Schweitzer, who I suppose some of you might know a little bit about. I often ask my students if they've ever heard of Albert Schweitzer, but if you haven't, you can Google it and find out. I want to talk about bribery then from this point of view. I think that definition turns bribery into a moral issue. And I think it's important, as in fact Jeff has suggested earlier on, that it be understood as a moral issue. It was interesting when I started out with Transparency International between 1993 and about probably the turn of the century, 2000. In Transparency International, you couldn't use the E word, and the E word was ethics. And the reason was because Transparency International, or the key leaders, believed that ethics, if people thought that bribery was an ethical issue, it would turn them off, that they would no longer be concerned with the issue of bribery. You had to establish that bribery was in fact a profit issue, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. I want to do a very brief history of bribery because I think it's important. Bribery, in the context in which we're thinking about it today, is a relatively recent phenomenon. The people I've talked to in business will say that while it's always been present in international commercial transactions, it really started to become a problem in the 1960s and 1970s as globalization began to develop, post-war phenomenon in that sense. And was identified in the first instance as a serious problem in the United States in the 1970s with respect to the Watergate scandal.